Just imagine, a 4-year-old boy with bright eyes and voice still full of childish traits, staring at his father and saying something that should be impossible. It is not fiction, it is not legend. It is a real story that shook the foundations of justice and challenged everything we believe about life, death, and what may exist beyond them. And it all started in a small municipality of Jalisco, where time seems to stop between the streets of Pedra and the bad hour of the church's bells. It was dawn of March 15, 2018 when, at Judge Roberto Mendoza's Solarenga house, a man known for his integrity and rigor, fate made one of his most intriguing strands. His wife, Carmen, had just given birth to a premature baby, a boy the doctors said they had no chance. But Diego, against all the odds, not only survived it but grew hard. And with him, there was also a secret that no father would be prepared to hear. The first crack in this apparent normality emerged on an October afternoon, when Diego, just 3.5 years old, played in the backyard under the shadow of the orange trees planted on his parents' wedding day. Suddenly, he ran to Roberto, who had his quiet coffee, and solved, with a frightening clarity for his age, "Father, why did you kill me in the electric chair?" The world stopped. The glass slipped from the judge's hands and shattered on the ceramic floor, echoing like a shot in the silence that settled. Carmen, who watered the plants, froze in place, the hose still dripping water. "What did you say, son?" Roberto managed to babble, his voice hoarse, as if he didn't belong to him. Diego, however, did not hesitate. With a seriousness that did not match his childish traits, he repeated, "The Lord killed me. I was Carlos, and the Lord was the judge who condemned me." The name echoed in Roberto's mind as a thunder: Carlos Ramirez. A case he had buried over a decade ago, a man executed by a triple homicide that shocked the region. A verdict that pursued him in nightmares for months. "Diego, my love," Carmen intervened, hurrying to get the boy on his lap, "children don't say these things." "Where did you hear that?" But the boy just shook his head, his dark eyes carrying a disturbing depth. "I didn't hear, Mother. I remember. I remember the exact words the father spoke when he condemned me." And then, in a voice that did not seem to leave a child, Diego began to recite, word for word, the sentence that Roberto had uttered years earlier in a closed room, without witnesses beyond those involved in the process. "Carlos Ramirez, this court declares him guilty of first-degree qualified homicide and condemns him to capital penalty, to be executed by electrocution." The floor seemed to open itself under Roberto's feet. Those words had never been disclosed, they were only in the court's confidential archives. How could a 3-year-old boy know them? Carmen, pale as a ghost, took Diego inside, but before leaving, the boy looked at his father last time and said, with a sadness that did not belong to his age, "I did not kill those people, Father." "You know that, don't you?" Roberto was alone in the backyard, surrounded by the shards of the glass and the certainty crumbling. Something beyond the logic was happening. That night, while Diego slept in his room decorated with toys and drawings, the judge remained agreed in his office, surrounded by law books that suddenly seemed useless. Carmen entered 2 cups of chamomile tea, steam rising as a sign that something needed to be calmed. "Do you think it's coincidence?" he asked, sitting next to him. Roberto took his glasses and rubbed his eyes, tired not by work, but for the weight of what he could not explain. "It can't be, Carmen. I only knew those words." "Neither did you know." And he was right at fear that it was just the beginning. In the following days, Diego began to reveal details that no child should know. Things about the case that marked Roberto's career forever. Details that suggested a terrible truth: what if the man he had condemned to death were innocent? The routine in the house of the Mendoza became a facade. Roberto continued to get up at 6, have his breakfast, go to the forum in his white pickup truck. But his mind was no longer in the processes on the table. It was in your son's words, "I don't. I killed those people, Dad." Carmen, in turn, tried to maintain normality, took Diego to school, shopping in the market, visited his mother to the Wednesdays. But just a loose phrase of the boy to collapse everything. Like that November afternoon, as she peeled oranges to make juice and Diego scribbled in her coloring notebook. Without lifting his eyes from the drawing, he said, "Mom, did you know that in prison they didn't give hot food on Sundays?" Carmen dropped the fruit. "Where did you get that, my son?" Diego looked at her with an expression that was not a child. "From my head. I remember that on Sundays there were only hard bread and water, and the guards laughed at us. And so, every day, with every memory that arose, the family was facing a question that no one would dare to ask aloud: had justice failed? And even more frightening, does life give a second chance to prove it? What is all the mismo meso buried bajo montañas of expedients and protocols ahora resurge with lightning landing? Prétend that Carlos Ramirez había followed to avoid el chaos, a detail that Inisacara finds in the police? I need los archivos del Ramirez case. All. Su's voice was a harsh slope, a loaded one urgently that did not admit replicas. Del otro side, su assistant balbució something about procedures y horarios, pero Roberto cortó el air con una hora which in the dejo spacio for objections. Cuando colgó, el silencio en la cocina was tan dense that one could cut by the filo de los hotcakes that Carmen había detoquemarse en el sartén. Diego, he won the storm that sus palabras habían untied, followed by soldiers, moviéndolos information how he recreated batalla that soil el understood. Carmen sees Roberto y le tomó el brazo con una fuerza who record su miedo. We can ignore it. Sus ojos, formerly linos de duda, ahora ardían with sure that her terrorizaba. Si Diego is desatiendo their verdad. Si les Carlos. Basta. Roberto is let go as if he would have, pero in the wrath, bell by the panic that he climbed by la throata's bile. You say eso. In the low pinzas sicara. Pero las palabras sonaron vacías, because both knew that yo was late for negarlo. Too late. Esa misma late, mientras Diego sleevan la siesta by the polish applied against el pecho, Roberto and studies hay una pil of expedients that alían the povio y please. Las pages amarillenta crujian bajo sus fingers like dry hues. Ale stabs all, il informa ballistic, los testimonia de los vecinos, las fotos of la escena del crimen. Y ale, among líneas borrasosa ensayos officials, I find it that Habasai paraded by alto hace 5 años, el informa de la mesura. A document marked as testimoniano admitted by extemporaneous, signed by Marcela Gutierrez, who swears haber seen de Carlos Ramirez en su restaurant hasta las 21:30, time she is completely exculpates. Roberto dijo que el papel es si mamara. 5 años. 5 años condemning a hombre prohibas circumstances, 5 años ignoring a testonia that pod haberlo saved, 5 años sleeping bajo el mismo techo that el ghost of su error. Y ahora, this ghost tenía el rostro de su yo. Cuando Carmen enters sin lamer, lo find la cabeza between las manos, hombre secured by celoso that no container. Encontré el testimonio de Marcela. Su voice was a hilillo rototo. Verdadero. All was true. Carmen in the preguentum. In the hacerlo need. If so side with silence, Mitreres fled el vento azotaba los gindles as if he was in Vierne wanted to come to complain justicia. Because some of them, by the way, ignores themselves too much, terminant charges in unique bad forms. Why this time, he believed había Lidia in the form of a niño with too much viejos y memories that in the lu belongering. Finding bads what breathing, estoy untilling una lie tan large that I packed to derive on the soil mi carrera, bell. Everything I thought was justice. Roberto's voice trembled, but not because of the base of the basement, but for the weight of what his eyes had just confirmed. 3 days. 3 days between the arrest and the finding of the weapon. 3 days in which someone living with power, with connections, had had time to manufacture evidence, to sow doubts where there should only be certainties. And he, Judge Roberto Mendoza, the guardian of the law, had signed the sentence with that evidence falsified under his arm. Roberto? Carmen's voice across the phone was a whisper full of fear. What did you find? He closed his eyes, as if in doing so he could erase the images that now burned his retina, the report with the suspicious firm, the dates that did not square, the name of Rodolfo Vasquez written with discolored ink in a document that smelled of rotten. When he opened them again, his gaze stuck in an annotation, almost illegible, written in a hurry, verify alibi of the golden stove. Witness, Marcela S. Marcela. The woman Diego swore had given him coverage that night. The woman who never declared in the trial. Carmen, he said, and his voice rang as if emerging from a well, I need you to go to the golden stove. Ask for Marcela. Tell him about Diego. tell him that it is about Carlos. And that if he does not speak now, the blood of an innocent will continue in our hands. A silence. Then, Carmen's sound containing breath. Do you think she will know something? Don't know. But if Diego is telling the truth, and every fiber of my being shouts that he is, then Marcela is the only living person who can prove that Carlos was not in that house at 7:30 at night. That could not have killed them. Hung before Carmen could answer. There was no time for doubts, or for the luxo of indecision. He took out his phone and looked for a number that had not marked for more than a decade, that of Detective Mauricio Salinas, the man whose falsified signature was now burning his fingers. 3 tones. 4. 5. Salinas. The voice on the other side was rough, as if time had linked it until it left only sharp edges. Mauricio. I am Roberto Mendoza. A pause. Then, a dry laugh, without joy. Wow, go. The judge who never goes back. What brings you here, licensed? Nostalgia? Roberto pressed the phone until the knuckles hurt. It's not nostalgia. It is about the Ramirez case. About the weapon. The silence that followed was so dense that Roberto could hear the crunch of the papers on the other side, as if Salinas had just dropped a file on his desk. That case is closed, Mendoza. You closed it. The weapon was planted, Roberto said, bluntly. The firm in the report is not yours. And Rodolfo Vasquez lied. Another pause. This time, longer. When Salinas spoke again, his tone had changed. There was no mockery, only tiredness. The tiredness of a man who had been dragging an invisible body for years. You know I can't talk about this by phone. Then let's talk in person. Now. Salinas sighed. I'm at the La Shadow Bar, on Juarez Street. But I warn you, what you are going to listen will not like. And what is worse, the detective's voice broke hard, you will not be able to do anything about it. Roberto was already walking towards the exit, the file tight against his chest as a useless shield. I don't care, he said. I just need the truth. But when he came to the gray sunset, a question hit him with the strength of a verdict. What if the truth was worse than the lie? True. And not only that, it was the confirmation that his son, with just 3 years, had dragged from the shadows of his previous memory a weight that neither the most experienced adults could have supported. Roberto felt the bitter taste of bile in his throat. 11 years. 11 years of an unfair conviction, 11 years of a man buried under the weight of a rotten system, 11 years in which he, as a judge, had signed that sentence with his own pen, believing in the justice that had served him in a silver tray. And Carlos's lawyer? He asked, in the voice broken by a rage that could no longer contain. Was he also in the game? Salinas exhaled the smoke of the cigar as if it were the last breath of its decency. The lawyer. He paused, passing his fingers through the spent on the table. The lawyer knew. But I had no evidence. And when? Do had them a pause loaded with poison dash, they hit him on the road to Cuernavaca. Accident, the newspapers said. Roberto felt that the walls of the room closed on him. It wasn't just corruption. It was a mechanism, well-oiled gears that crushed lives to keep the machine turning. And he had been one of his wheels. Why now? Salinas suddenly got up, with his eyes injected into blood. Why now come to relive this? Why didn't he keep his conscience clean, like everyone else? Because my son Roberto squeezed his fists until his nails drawn half-moons in Las Palmas remembers. Remember the smell of gunpowder in your clothes that night. Remember fear when they dragged the dungeon. Remember, the name of the true murderer. The silence that followed was so dense that it seemed solid. Salinas staggered back, as if those words had hit him in the chest. My God, he murmured. The child. He is not a child. Roberto advanced one step, with the shadow of despair lengthening at his feet. He is a witness. And if we don't do something, they will silence him as they silenced others. Salinas ran a hand on his face, as if he could erase the peculiar wrinkles that marked him. The victim's brother calls himself the graduate now. It has legal business, properties, even a foundation for victims of violence. A dry laugh escaped from his lips. Ironies of fate, right? Where is? In the capital. It has an office in Polanco, but it will not be easy to approach. He has security, contacts in the prosecutor's office. Salinas took a wrinkled paper out of pocket and slid it on the table. Here is the address. And this, he added, giving him a fat spotted envelope, are copies of the original reports. Those who never arrived at the court. Roberto took the envelope with hands that were trembling. Inside, the weight of truth was almost unbearable. A last question, he said, with the voice so cold that he froze the air between them. Why tell me now? Why can't 11 years ago, when there was still time? Salinas turned off the cigar against the ashtray, leaving a black mark on the glass. Because 11 years ago, I was afraid, he confessed. But now, he looked towards the window, where the twilight dyed the sky of a bloody red. Now I only have the hell. And I prefer to burn here, telling you the truth, than to continue living in this lie. Roberto kept the envelope in the internal pocket of his bag. When he left that house, the air smelled of wetland and betrayal. He went up to his car, but did not turn on the engine immediately. In the rearview mirror, he saw his own reflection, a man on the edge of the abyss, with the eyes of those who can no longer go back. Because now I knew. It was not just exhuming a case. It was to dig up a system. And the first body to come to light would be his own. Tell us something that only Carlos Ramirez would know? The boy nodded, adjusting the flaps of his bag with a seriousness that did not correspond to his 3 years. His small, but firm fingers, clinging to the edge of the stand, while his green eyes, as very eyes that Roberto had seen shining in the photos of a convicted man, stuck in the magistrate with an intensity that froze the blood of more than one in the room. The mechanical workshop of Don Rufino smelled of burned gasoline and Café Rancio, he said, without blinking. Carlos worked there on Tuesdays and Thursday afternoon, after leaving the restaurant La Casona, where Marcela kept him a dish of green enchiladas because he knew it was his favorite. The prosecutor was incredulous, but Judge Vega silenced him with a gesture. Diego continued, imperturbable. The day they arrested me, I had a blue shirt with a broken button on my neck. The policeman who hit me in his stomach was called Ortega, but everyone told him the sergeant because he had previously been in the army. And in cell 12. I paused, swallowing saliva. The Jacinto guard told me, Ramirez, you are not going out of here. I live every time I took my food. But the worst was not that. The worst thing was to listen to the screams of others. Those who were not lucky. A chill toured the room. Roberto felt how sweat slipped around his neck. That detail. Nobody outside the walls of that prison could know. The shouts of others were the best saved secret of the Grande. NDE, the punishment cells where the problematic prisoners disappeared for days. Only those who had been there, or who had sent them, knew it. Judge Vega leaned forward, the white knuckles by force with which he pressed the hammer. Diego. Can you tell me what happened on the night of February 12, 2007? The boy closed his eyes for a moment, as if the memory burned him. That night was not in the robbery. He was with Marcela in his department, watching Titanic on a pirate DVD that stuck every 10 minutes. She fell asleep on my shoulder, and I looked at the roof, thinking of buying a ring of commitment to the money she had saved. But the next day, when I went out to buy bread, they were already waiting for me. They put a car without plates, with the polarized glass. The man who was driving had a crescent-shaped scar on the left temple. Diego touched his own temple with a trembling finger. He told me, Ramirez, this is over today. Or you declare yourself guilty, or your girlfriend disappears. The prosecutor jumped, but the words were already there, floating in the air like a verdict. Because that scar was unmistakable. He belonged to Hector L. Luna Valdez, an exagent of the judicial whose photo appeared in the secret archives of the prosecutor's office as a key witness in the Ramirez case. A witness who, according to the records, had never declared under oath. Judge Vega looked at Roberto. There was no need for words. Both knew what they had just heard. It was not the testimony of a child. It was the voice of a dead man, crying out justice from the other side of the veil. "Lords," Roberto said, getting up with a calm that he did not feel, "I request that this court declare the sentence against Carlos Ramirez Mendoza for procedure vices, manufacture of evidence and systematic violation of human rights. And demand that an immediate investigation against the officials involved in this judicial farce begins." The silence that followed was not surprise. It was scary. Because in that room, at that moment, everyone understood the same terrifying truth. The system had not only killed an innocent. The system had created a ghost. And now, the ghost had returned to collect. In that Diego's fingers touched the cold metal of the metal, something changed in the air. It was not a memory that invaded him, but a quiet certainty, like the last sigh of a wind that finally finds rest. His hands, small but firm, closed the fingers around the symbol that Carlos had taken against his chest for years, the same that accompanied him in his laughter, in his working days under the sun of the workshop, and even on that dark night when justice abandoned him. Amparo observed how the child held the chain, perhaps waiting for a flash of recognition, a spark of that past that once inhabited his eyes. But Diego just smiled, a clean smile, without shadows. "It's beautiful," he said, and hung around his neck without hesitation. "I remain, yes?" Roberto and Carmen exchanged a look full of emotions that did not need words. Amparo nodded, drying the tears with the back of his hand. "Sure, my child. It's yours now." There were no more questions or explanations. Because some things are not understood by reason, but the soul. And at that moment, everyone knew that the circle had closed. Carlos was no longer a ghost tied to an injustice, nor a name in a dusty file. It was, again, the brother who Amparo missed, the man who Don Eusebio remembered in his workshop, the innocent whose memory now lived in Roberto's struggle, in Diego's laugh, in that metal that shone weakly in the afternoon light. Outside, San Miguel de las Torres remained the same cobbled streets, the same relentless sun, the same murmurs of a town that had seen too much. But something had changed forever. Because sometimes, justice does not arrive with signed documents or sentences read aloud. Sometimes, it arrives with the bright eyes of a child who chooses to forgive the world before the world teaches him to be cruel. And while Diego ran back to the patio, dragging the chain against his shirt, Roberto Mendoza knew that it was not a story about ghosts. It was a story about redemption. And redemption, in the end, always finds its way. Diego's fingers just. They touched the cold metal of the metal when something inside it shuddered. It was not tears of sadness that appeared in their eyes, but the silent recognition of a link that transcended time. "He feels as if he had already taken it before," he whispered, in a voice that seemed to come from much further than his 8 years. Amparo, with hands that trembled only for an instant, the chain lay him. "Carlos would have wanted it to be yours." It was not any inheritance, it was a real legacy, a fragment of soul that finally found its place. Diego looked for Roberto's eyes in Carmen, that look that only a child knows how to direct when he asks for permission for something he already feels like his own. They nodded speechless, because some decisions do not need explanation, they feel in the chest, like a beat that was always there. When the weight of the metal rested on his neck, Diego did not say thanks for education. He said it because, at that moment, he understood that he was receiving more than an object, he was accepting a mission. Amparo stayed to dinner that night, and between food dishes and laughs that filled the silences of years, he gave them pieces of Carlos that no court had been able to erase. He spoke of the man who distributed his lunch with the abandoned dogs of the neighborhood, of the young man who worked until the exhaustion to pay the treatment of his mother, of the dreamer who kept house cuts with gardens because he longed to fill them with others. "It was good," Amparo repeated, while his fingers caressed the edge of the plate as if they were looking for the touch of a hand that was no longer. "That's why I never understood how it ended like this, until you returned your name." When he said goodbye, he hugged Diego for so long that Roberto had to look away, because there are gratitude that hurts so pure. "Thank you for returning," he whispered in his ear, in a voice broken by relief. "Thank you for not letting my brother die twice." And Diego, who still did not fully understand the weight of his words, only nodded against his shoulder, because sometimes the body knows what the mind is not yet to name. Later, Roberto found him on the patio swing, gently swinging under a starry sky that seemed to have waited for this moment to reveal himself. The metal shone on his shirt, like a beacon in the dark. "What do you think, son?" he asked, sitting next to him. Diego did not look up. His eyes were still fixed on the horizon, as if there, in the shadows of the trees, he could see something else. "In which Carlos is no longer sad," he replied. "Before, when I thought about him, he felt a knot here," he touched his chest, "but now it's as if the air were different. As if he knew it's fine." Roberto wanted to ask if he believed in ghosts, in past lives, in those things that adults call superstitions until life shows them that the world is wider than fit in their manuals. But before he opened his mouth, Diego looked at him with a serenity that did not belong to his age. "Do you think he left forever, Dad?" The question was not out of curiosity. It was for certainty. Roberto breathed deeply, looking for words that would not betray the mystery. But Diego already had his answer. "I think he never left," he said, touching his heart. "I think I was just waiting for someone to remember it as it was. To remind me that I have to be good. I have to help." "And you are no longer afraid?" Roberto asked, although he already knew the answer. "No," Diego replied, smiling for the first time in years without fear stealing his light from his eyes. "I'm no longer afraid of anything." That night, the dream that visited him was not an echo of nightmares. There were no cells, or shouts, nor the shadow of an electric chair stalking in the dark. He dreamed of a place where the light did not burn, but hugged, and in the midst of her, a tall man, of a quiet smile and hands who did not wear handcuffs, leaned towards him and said, "Thank you for helping me find the way home." Upon awakening, Diego did not remember the details, but he carried with him the certainty of those who have been touched by something sacred. He felt free. Not as who is released from chains, but as who, finally, understands that he never took them. The years passed, and Diego grew up with the metal against his skin and Carlos's memory as a lighthouse. He did not become a lawyer by chance, or to continue the PA. You are from his father, but because he carried in his blood the call of those who had no voice. He defended the innocents with a ferocity that amazed the courts, because he knew, in a place that neither logic nor laws could achieve, that justice was not a concept, but an act of love. Roberto Mendoza, meanwhile, retired at 70 years, leaving behind a legacy that transcended the files, 6 lives rescued from the shadow of the unfair conviction, a judicial system that finally looked at his cracks in the eyes, and a law firm, Justicia Ramirez, that became synonymous with hope for those who believed lost. The Ramirez-Mendoza case not only changed laws, he rewrote the meaning of justice. Protocols were created that forced the evidence to speak clearly, commissions that reviewed forgotten cases, and a new figure in the courts, the defender of innocence, a guardian against the errors that the system insisted on repeating. But beyond the codes and decrees, Diego's story left an indelible mark on the heart of a country, the proof that the truth does not give up, even before death. Sometimes, redemption comes wrapped in the memories of a child who never lived what he remembers, to heal wounds that should never have been open. In the cemetery of San Miguel de las Torres, the tombstone that previously carried the epitaph Carlos Ramirez, executed by multiple homicide, now says simply, Carlos Ramirez, a good man, victim of injustice, exonerated by love. Every year, on the anniversary of its exoneration, a family takes flowers to that grave. Diego, already adult, deposits red carnations, the color of passion, but also of the blood spilled by mistake, and whisper, "Thank you for teaching me that the truth always finds its path." Because that was the most powerful lesson of all, that love knows no borders, not even those that separate this world from the other. That true justice does not stop at the impossible. And that, sometimes, miracles do not arrive with trumpets or lightning, but with the quiet voice of a child who remembers what he never lived, to repair what he should never have broken. And you? Have you ever felt that life whispered a truth that you could not explain? Do you think there are justices that transcend what we see? Leave us your reflection, because stories like this remind us that the world is made of mysteries that expect to be heard. If this story resonated with you, share your light, a like to honor those who fight for the truth, a comment to continue exploring these enigma, and a subscription so as not to lose the cases that challenge everything we thought we know. Because reality, in the end, is much more extraordinary than we dare to imagine.